if they once steeled themselves to go through the present agony of parting, they would almost certainly be happier 10 years hence than marriage is at all likely to make them. Even then, they would not part. To Eros all these calculations are irrelevant, just as the coolly brutal judgment of Lucretius is irrelevant to Venus. Even when it becomes clear beyond all evasion that marriage with the beloved cannot possibly lead to happiness, when it cannot even profess to offer any other life than that of tending an incurable invalid, of hopeless poverty, of exile, or of disgrace, Eros never hesitates to say, better this than parting. Better to be miserable with her than happy without her. Let our hearts break provided they break together. If the voice within us does not say this, it is not the voice of Eros. This is the grandeur and terror of love. But notice, as before, side by side with this grandeur, the playfulness. Eros, as well as Venus, is the subject of countless jokes. And even when the circumstances of the two lovers are so tragic that no bystander could keep back his tears, they themselves in want, in hospital wards, on visitors' days in jail, will sometimes be surprised by a merriment which strikes the onlooker, but not them, as unbearably pathetic. Nothing is falser than the idea that mockery is necessarily hostile. Until they have a baby to laugh at, lovers are always laughing at each other. It is in the grandeur of Eros that the seeds of danger are concealed. He has spoken like a god. His total commitment, his reckless disregard of happiness, his transcendence of self-regard, sound like a message from the eternal world. And yet it cannot, just as it stands, be the voice of God himself. For Eros, speaking with that very grandeur and displaying that very transcendence of self, may urge to evil as well as to good. Nothing is shallower than the belief that a love which leads to sin is always qualitatively lower, more animal or more trivial than one which leads to faithful, fruitful and Christian marriage. The love which leads to cruel and perjured unions, even to suicide pacts and murder, is not likely to be wandering lust or idle sentiment. It may well be Eros in all his splendor, heartbreakingly sincere, ready for every sacrifice except renunciation. There have been schools of thought which accepted the voice of Eros as something actually transcendent and tried to justify the absoluteness of his commands. Plato will have it that falling in love is the mutual recognition on earth of souls which have been singled out for one another in a previous and celestial existence. To meet the beloved is to realize we loved before we were born. As a myth to express what lovers feel, this is admirable. But if one accepted it literally, one would be faced by an embarrassing consequence. We should have to conclude that in that heavenly and forgotten life affairs were no better managed than here. For Eros may unite the most unsuitable yoke fellows, many unhappy, and predictably unhappy, marriages were love matches. A theory more likely to be accepted in our own day is what we may call Shavian. Shaw himself might have said metabiological-romanticism. According to Shavian romanticism, the voice of Eros is the voice of the Ella vital or life force, the evolutionary appetite. In overwhelming a particular couple, it is seeking parents, or ancestors, for the Superman. It is indifferent both to their personal happiness and to the rules of morality because it aims at something which Shaw thinks very much more important, the future perfection of our species. But if all this were true, it hardly makes clear whether, and if so, why we should obey it. All pictures yet offered us of the Superman are so unattractive that one might well vow celibacy at once to avoid the risk of begetting him. And secondly, this theory surely leads to the conclusion that the life force does not very well understand its, or her, or his, own business. So far as we can see, the existence or intensity of Eros between two people is no warrant that their offspring will be especially satisfactory, or even that they will have offspring at all. Two good strains, in the stockbreeder's sense, not two good lovers, is the recipe for fine children. And what on earth was the life force doing through all those countless generations when the begetting of children depended very little on mutual Eros and very much on arranged marriages, slavery, and rape? Has it only just thought of this bright idea for improving the species? Neither the Platonic nor the Shavian type of erotic transcendentalism can help a Christian. We are not worshippers of the life force and we know nothing of previous existences. We must not give unconditional obedience to the voice of Eros when he speaks most like a god. Neither must we ignore or attempt to deny the god-like quality. This love is really and truly like love himself. In it there is a real nearness to God, by resemblance, but not, therefore, and necessarily, a nearness of approach. Eros, honored so far as love of God and charity to our fellows will allow, may become for us a means of approach. His total commitment is a paradigm or example, built into our natures, of the love we ought to exercise towards God and man. As nature, for the nature lover, gives a content to the word glory, so this gives a content to the word charity. It is as if Christ said to us through Eros, thus just like this with this prodigality, not counting the cost, you are to love me and the least of my brethren. Our conditional honor to Eros will of course vary with our circumstances. Of some a total renunciation, but not a contempt, is required. Others, with Eros as their fuel and also as their model, can embark on the married life, within which Eros, of himself, will never be enough, will indeed survive only in so far as he is continually chastened and corroborated by higher principles. But Eros, honored without reservation and obeyed unconditionally, becomes a demon. And this is just how he claims to be honored and obeyed. Divinely indifferent to our selfishness, he is also demoniac ally rebellious to every claim of God or man that would oppose him. Hence, as the poet says, people in love cannot be moved by kindness. And opposition makes them feel like martyrs. Martyrs is exactly right. Years ago when I wrote about medieval love poetry and described its strange, half make-believe, religion of love, I was blind enough to treat this as an almost purely literary phenomenon. I know better now. Eros by his nature invites it. Of all loves he is, at his height, most godlike, therefore most prone to demand our worship. Of himself he always tends to turn being in love into a sort of religion. Theologians have often feared, in this love, a danger of idolatry. I think they meant by this that the lovers might idolize one another. That does not seem to me to be the real danger, certainly not in marriage. The deliciously plain prose and business-like intimacy of married life render it absurd. So does the affection in which Eros is almost invariably clothed. Even in courtship I question whether anyone who has felt the thirst for the uncreated, or even dreamed of feeling it, ever supposed that the beloved could satisfy it. As a fellow pilgrim pierced with the very same desire, that is, as a friend, the beloved may be gloriously and helpfully relevant, but as an object for it, well, I would not be rude, ridiculous. The real danger seems to me not that the lovers will idolize each other but that they will idolize Eros himself. I do not of course mean that they will build altars or say prayers to him. The idolatry I speak of can be seen in the popular misinterpretation of our Lord's words, her sins, which are many, are forgiven her, for she loved much, Luke 7:47. From the context, and especially from the preceding parable of the debtors, it is clear that this must mean, the greatness of her love for me is evidence of the greatness of the sins I have forgiven her. The for here is like the for in, he can't have gone out, for his hat is still hanging in the hall. The presence of the hat is not the cause of his being in the house but a probable proof that he is. But thousands of people take it quite differently. They first assume, with no evidence, that her sins were sins against chastity, though, for all we know, they may have been usury, dishonest shopkeeping, or cruelty to children. And they then take our Lord to be saying, I forgive her unchastity because she was so much in love. The implication is that a great Eros extenuates, almost sanctions, almost sanctifies any actions it leads to. When lovers say of some act that we might blame, love made us do it, notice the tone. A man saying, I did it because I was frightened, or I did it because I was angry, speaks quite differently. He is putting forward an excuse for what he feels to require excusing. But the lovers are seldom doing quite that. Notice how tremulously, almost how devoutly, they say the word love, not so much pleading an extenuating circumstance as appealing to an authority. The confession can be almost a boast. There can be a shade of defiance in it. They feel like martyrs. In extreme cases what their words really express is a demure yet unshakable allegiance to the God of love. These reasons in love's law have passed for good, says Milton's Delilah. That is the point, in love's law. In love, we have our own law, a religion of our own God. Where a true Eros is present, resistance to his commands feels like apostasy, and what are really, by the Christian standard, temptations speak with the voice of duties, quasi-religious duties, acts of pious zeal to love. He builds his own religion round the lovers. Benjamin Constant has noticed how he creates for them, in a few weeks or months, a joint past which seems to them immemorial. They recur to it continually with wonder and reverence, as the psalmists recur to the history of Israel. It is in fact the Old Testament of love's religion, the record of love's judgments and mercies towards his chosen pair up to the moment when they first knew they were lovers. After that, its New Testament begins. They are now under a new law, under what corresponds, in this religion, to grace. They are new creatures. The spirit of Eros supersedes all laws, and they must not grieve it. It seems to sanction all sorts of actions they would not otherwise have dared. I do not mean solely, or chiefly, acts that violate chastity. They are just as likely to be acts of injustice or unchanged righty against the outer world. They will seem like proofs of piety and zeal towards Eros. The pair can say to one another in an almost sacrificial spirit, it is for love's sake that I have neglected my parents, left my children, cheated my partner, failed my friend at his greatest need. These reasons in love's law have passed for good. The votaries may even come to feel a particular merit in such sacrifices. What costlier offering can be laid on love's altar than one's conscience? And all the time the grim joke is that this Eros, whose voice seems to speak from the eternal realm, is not himself necessarily even permanent. He is notoriously the most mortal of our loves. The world rings with complaints of his fickleness. What is baffling is the combination of this fickleness with his protestations of permanency. To be in love is both to intend and to promise lifelong fidelity. Love makes vows unasked, can't be deterred from making them. "I will be ever true," are almost the first words he utters. Not hypocritically but sincerely. No experience will cure him of the delusion. We have all heard of people who are in love again every few years, each time sincerely convinced that this time it's the real thing, that their wanderings are over, that they have found their true love and will themselves be true till death. And yet Eros is in a sense right to make this promise. The event of falling in love is of such a nature that we are right to reject as intolerable the idea that it should be transitory. In one high bound it has overleaped the massive wall of our selfhood, it has made appetite itself altruistic, tossed personal happiness aside as a triviality and planted the interests of another in the center of our being. Spontaneously and without effort we have fulfilled the law, towards one person, by loving our neighbor as ourselves. It is an image, a foretaste, of what we must become to all if love himself rules in us without a rival. It is even, well used, a preparation for that. Simply to relapse from it, merely to fall out of love again, is, if I may coin the ugly word, a sort of disredemption. Eros is driven to promise what Eros of himself cannot perform. Can we be in this selfless liberation for a lifetime? Hardly for a week. Between the best possible lovers this high condition is intermittent. The old self soon turns out to be not so dead as he pretended as after a religious conversion. In either he may be momentarily knocked flat, he will soon be up again, if not on his feet, at least on his elbow, if not roaring, at least back to his surly grumbling or his mendicant whine. And Venus will often slip back into mere sexuality. But these lapses will not destroy a marriage between two decent and sensible people. The couple whose marriage will certainly be endangered by them, and possibly ruined, are those who have idolized Eros. They thought he had the power and truthfulness of a god. They expected that mere feeling would do for them, and permanently, all that was necessary. When this expectation is disappointed they throw the blame on Eros or, more usually, on their partners. In reality, however, Eros, having made his gigantic promise and shown you in glimpses what its performance would be like, has done his stuff. He, like a godparent, makes the vows, it is we who must keep them. It is we who must labor to bring our daily life into even closer accordance with what the glimpses have revealed. We must do the works of Eros when Eros is not present. This all good lovers know, though those who are not reflective or articulate will be able to express it only in a few conventional phrases about taking the rough along with the smooth, not expecting too much, having a little common sense, and the like. And all good Christian lovers know that this program, modest as it sounds, will not be carried out except by humility, charity, and divine grace, that it is indeed the whole Christian life seen from one particular angle. Thus Eros, like the other loves, but more strikingly because of his strength, sweetness, terror, and high port, reveals his true status. He cannot of himself be what, nevertheless, he must be if he is to remain Eros. He needs help, therefore needs to be ruled. The god dies or becomes a demon unless he obeys God. It would be well if, in such case, he always died. But he may live on, mercilessly chaining together two mutual tormentors, each raw all over with the poison of hate and love, each ravenous to receive and implacably refusing to give, jealous, suspicious, resentful, struggling for the upper hand, determined to be free and to allow no freedom, living on scenes. Read Anna Karenina, and do not fancy that such things happen only in Russia. The lovers' old hyperbole of eating each other can come horribly near to the truth. Chapter 6. Charity. William Morris wrote a poem called Love is Enough, and someone is said to have reviewed it briefly in the words "it isn't." Such has been the burden of this book. The natural loves are not self-sufficient. Something else, at first vaguely described as decency and common sense, but later revealed as goodness, and finally as the whole Christian life in one particular relation, must come to the help of the mere feeling if the feeling is to be kept sweet. To say this is not to belittle the natural loves but to indicate where their real glory lies. It is no disparagement to a garden to say that it will not fence and weed itself, nor prune its own fruit trees.